Greetings, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our classes for everyone at the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion. It's my pleasure to welcome you. This is the second week of an eight-part series with Professor David Hooker on imagining new stories of race and religion. If you don't know me already, my name is Mahan Mirza. I'm the Executive Director of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion. Many of you are joining us from last week and continuing on. We also have some new registrants, so welcome to all of you. The course is really about grappling with the fact that the human beings, we live our life in story. And the narrative that we tell ourselves, that we believe, shapes our reality. And if we can change our stories, we can change our reality and consequently change the world. We are in the realm of the intersection of race and religion, and we have perhaps one of the best people, like I said last time, and I mean it, in the world to guide us through these conversations, and that's Professor David Hooker. He is a professor of the practice at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, and he served many professional roles in the past, including Assistant Attorney General of Georgia. And last time we talked about the elections in Georgia and what happened in the Capitol riots. Since then, we've had an inauguration. It's been largely peaceful, although there were some tensions. And this week, we're going to move from current events and begin to talk about theorizing, how we think about these things a little bit. And some questions were shared with you from last time. One of the key questions was, how do we distinguish between a religion and a cult? So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Professor David Hooker to the stage. Thank you so much for guiding us through these discussions, and we look forward to another fantastic evening.
Thanks, Mahan, and welcome back to those of you who are back. Welcome back, and for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. Come on in. You'll notice that in that opening introductory slide, it says that I am a conversation facilitator, which is the intention for the way that we've structured these sessions is to facilitate conversation. And so what we have landed on as a rhythm is I'm going to offer a few remarks, some opening remarks to tee it up each week, and then invite 2 or 3 or 4 of our cohort members into a conversation, and then we'll just engage in conversation together. What I intended to do today, what I want to do today, is to just really briefly, this will be one of the few times where it occurs with a bit of lecture and theorizing, but what I really wanted to do is share a few ideas. I've got a few slides that I'm sharing with the intention of giving us shared language so that as we continue these conversations, new stories and really new narratives around race and religion, we have some shared language that we can work with. And so I want to share a few slides, and then we have a few members of the cohort that are going to come in. We're going to talk a bit about kind of the questions that we left with last week. So we left with the questions about what is religion, what is race, and then I want to add in a bit of conversation about cult, and that's going to move us as we think about it. But let's first just share let me just share a few specific thoughts, preliminary ideas with you that are in the realm of theorizing, just to get us started. I hope everybody can see my see the slides, right?
We can see them.
Yeah, you can? Perfect. Okay. So what we want to talk about just very briefly is the distinction between these ideas: story, narrative. I also want to talk a little bit about meta-narrative and just mention the distinction between ideology and hegemony, just so we can see how they play out in our lives, and so that we can have a shared vocabulary for the rest of our course, because sometimes these terms are used interchangeably when a precision of language might help us with some of the work. So let's just really quickly look at a couple of distinctions. Mahan was saying, we live our lives in story form, and stories are fairly well known to us. A particular sequence of events, usually situated in the past. Even when we tell a future narrative, we tell it as though it has already happened. Stories have, for the most part, a beginning, a middle, and end. Even if they're continuing, even the end game. I'm an Avengers fan. I'm a Marvel Marvel multiverse fan, and so even Endgame has there. Even when it seems like there's going to be another installation, there is an end. The story itself has an end. And stories are told in a particular way depending on the genre. So we give certain allowances for news stories, and we distinguish news stories. Sometimes we're able to distinguish news stories from fairy tales, from fiction. They all have a similar structural integrity, but the beginning, the middle, the end, the plot, the character, the like. Stories do a really good job of trying to identify things like motivation and desire, and there's sometimes context and background and setting, but all of that is in order to make sense of a situated and connective set of events. That's a story. Most of us are familiar with story. The distinction that I have learned to make, I didn't always make it, and in some of my earliest writing, I failed to make it. But the distinction that I've learned to make, which is really important, is that narrative, while it shares some story format in the sense that it also has trajectory, a narrative is a coherent system in which multiple interrelated stories can be connected, through which multiple interconnected stories can be connected. And so narratives create a trajectory, they create a realm of expectation, but they don't have an end. They may have some framing, there may be some underlying moral tension associated with a moral direction that's embedded in the narrative frame. But narrative is a framing in which many stories can be told and connected. And that becomes a really important distinction. So when someone tells a story, we listen to that story, but our listening is shaped by the narrative frame that we're listening within. So we have an expectation that the story goes a certain way because we have assigned it to a particular narrative framing. If you all have questions about that, let's make sure we wrestle with those questions early on. And then finally, a master narrative. It's a narrative that has become deeply embedded in a particular cultural context. So it has almost an archetypal way of existing. It's trans-historical in the sense that it has passed down through multiple generations. So something like a cowboy or the discovery, quote unquote, the discovery of Turtle Island, of what we now call the United States, is a kind of a master narrative, and it has some themes within it. And so there are certain stories that can be told that operate inside of this more um, ongoing, deeply embedded, culturally specific master narrative. And different cultures certainly have different master narratives that are operating. And so many cultures have the narrative of the trickster. We, US doesn't necessarily have that form. It's a form that's borrowed from many other cultures. Well, I say US, but I'm distinguishing US from indigenous First Nations people, the people who actually, are the rightful owners and occupants of the land on which we currently exist. Um, they they have a set of trickster narratives, a master narrative like that. But these are distinctions. I want to make sure we get these. These are distinctions between a story, a narrative, a master narrative, or sometimes a meta narrative, an overarching meta narrative. So just visually, a narrative connects a bunch of stories or allows us to make sense of multiple stories. Let me give you an example to make sure that you all understand this. And then we can ask some questions about it. Imagine there was a woman who spent $500,000, $500,000 to fraudulently document her child's resume so that the child had access to a particular college, could get entry into a particular college. It turns out that that practice is illegal. When discovered and prosecuted, the woman was sentenced to 1 month, or no, she was sentenced to 14 days in prison, and she was released for good behavior and for health concerns after 10 days. So she spent $500,000. She fraudulently got her child into college. She spent 10 days in jail. Another circumstance, a woman used her aunt's mailing address so that her child could enroll in a public school that was in the district where her aunt lives, as opposed to the public school in the district where she lives. It turns out that's also fraud. That woman was prosecuted and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Fed time means that you do every day of it. There's no federal parole system. There's no federal probation system. You do every day of Fed time. And so 5 years for using the aunt's address to get her child into a public school, as opposed to 10 days for bribing university officials and falsifying federal applications. And you try to figure out what makes sense of those two stories. And I would suggest possibly that if you add race in as the context in which those two stories are connected, then it begins to make some sense, right? This is kind of showing how a particular narrative form or a particular narrative can connect multiple stories and allow you to make sense of them. Because otherwise, those two stories standing alone, side by side, may not quite make sense, right? Maybe you can make sense of them. So just really quickly, a couple of other ideas. Ideology is kind of multiple narratives that are connected together with a particular, in some ways, binding a particular set of groups together, either thought groups or identity groups in some way, circumscribe or they they coalesce around particular ideologies. Um, the difference between ideology and hegemony is hegemony suggests a certain kind of power or dominance. And ideology can become hegemonic in the sense that you can use or utilize the narratives embedded in a particular ideology to become a dominant force, a dominating oppressive force. And so ideology can become hegemonic, but the two aren't necessarily, they're not interchangeable. So in the same way that sometimes people talk about ideology and hegemony as being interchangeable, I want to distinguish those. And at the same time, people talk about narrative and story as being either similar or interchangeable. I want to distinguish those so that we can have a certain precision in the way that we talk about them, right? So we've distinguished between ideology and hegemony and narrative and story. And what we are reminded is that social narratives possess a particular energy. Embedded in the narrative are emotions and expectations, and individuals and other entities are positioned in certain ways so that there is a power dynamic associated with or embedded in the narrative. Social narratives have energy, and those narratives are what we use to make sense of all of the different systems. And so the assumptions that are embedded in various narratives then are used as the way of organizing and sense making when we think about the structure of family, when we think about the nature of individual and group identities, the way that schools are shaped, the way that play areas are structured, how our churches are organized, and then in the way that mass media and welfare and law are all structured, organized, made sense of. It is within particular narrative framings that all of this happens. And so this is just to say that narratives are infused with social power, and that those narratives get reproduced everywhere in all the, at every level, micro, meso, exo, macro, meta systems. And these happen over time. And so some narrative form gives meaning to systems and structures. Michel Foucault tells us that you can never understand a system by studying the operation of the system. You have to understand the narrative framing within which that system operates and is given its sense making. So you have to understand the narrative in order to make sense of the system. You can't change a system by changing just the rules and the structure of the system. You have to change the system by changing the structure of the narrative in which that system, within which that system is given its sense making. So I'm going to stop for a second and just see to make sure we have any, if there are any questions, clarifying questions about those, and then I want to invite a couple of folks to the panel.
Okay, the next question is by Ronnie Ansari. Does each storyteller tell the event the same way? There's a couple of words there I don't get. Does each storyteller tell the event the same way? And then a third question that popped up, would this be right? In order to change a system, the narrative has to be changed. So these are some of the questions.
Right. So yes, in order to change a system, narratives have to change. I'll tell you why. I'm coming to the other piece. I talk about this in some other places as the connection between legacy and aftermath. Legacy, if you think of it as what we inherit, legacy is the history, the mythology, the folklore, the family narratives, the lies that get passed down to us. We receive those. That's the legacy. And then the aftermath is like the rubble. If you think about aftermath um, after some kind of a disaster, after a hurricane or tsunami or something like this, there's all of this rubble, right? And the rubble in this instance, the aftermath, are the structural elements, the policies, the practices, the symbolism, the cultural symbolisms that exist. Those policies, legal structures, the practices are connected to narratives, to stories. When the narrative, not to stories, to narratives, when the narratives change, the policies necessarily change. They stop making sense. And so it's possible to change them. But you have to change both the narrative and the legacy and the aftermath at the same time. Because if you just change the structure, but you don't change the narrative, then new emerging ways of performing that same narrative will reemerge. And so will look very much like the old structures. One of the ways that you begin to change or shift is through counter narratives. And counter narratives are particular efforts at working against dominating, marginalizing narratives. There are particular structures for how you build, or particular practices for how you build effective counter narratives that can help to shift the narrative form so that you can begin to also change structures. Now, the reason that people don't all tell the story the same way, for several reasons. One, neuropsychologists will tell you that there are, at any given moment, there are 11 million bits of data that you can pay attention to. But because of the schema, the mindsets, the frameworks that we operate in, we pay attention to different bits of data, and then we connect them in different ways inside of the narrative framings that we're operating in, the world viewings that we're operating in. It's not like everybody has one solid stationary world view, but you have multiple world view, and they're always contextually shifting in some ways, contextually accounting for what's in front of you. So it's world viewing as opposed to world view. Some places the world viewing is less flexible, so it feels more rigid, so it feels like a world view, but it's world viewing. And so people don't relate the stories the same, maybe because they're operating from a different narrative form, but also because they're just picking up on different data based on their own way of understanding what information matters in order to tell a story. What I want to do at this point, when we get to talk about, because several of you answered the questions, offered responses to the idea about what is religion and what is race. And so now I wanted to invite, we had a few cohort members that were willing to be panelists, not wanted to, they didn't raise their hand and rush out and say, I want to play, but they were willing to play. And so I want to invite them in and have them briefly introduce themselves, and then we're going to start having this conversation about religion and race and how that relates to narrative. So let's see.
Started introducing myself while you figure that out. Mark Rolfus, class 84. I was an anthropology major. I had a black roommate at Notre Dame. Junior year, there was no drama attached to it. We got along great, and we're still good friends to this day. Later in life, I went and did prison ministry. And then in 2014, I moved to South Africa for a year and a half to become a director of an orphanage. I got to see a different perspective on race. When you go to a place where you're the minority and you have culture shock and reverse coming back, where I say, oh my God, you think we have real racism in America? Go to South Africa if you want to see real income inequality. I tend to be an optimist about race. I think we're, as a society, we've gotten better, and I want to have an optimistic story going forward to be part of.
Good evening, everybody.
Would you introduce yourself as well?
Hi, I'm Alex Xu. I'm a professor at the Ansari Institutes. I study medieval Chinese Buddhism and religion and global affairs, but I'm also just a citizen and enjoyer of stories. So that's why I'm here tonight.
Perfect. So I want to invite each of the two of you, Alex and Mark, I'm going to invite each of you to say, what is religion? What makes something religion?
I think religion's a sense of why the world is here, how it was created, what's our purpose here, something that gives you the answers to those types of questions, to me, is religion, which explains the purpose of human beings as totality and as individuals.
Got it. Alex, what would you add to that, or how would you think differently about that?
This is a huge question.
Yeah.
My background is in religious studies, so we
I knew
talk
that.
about the definition of religion all the time. It's what I bring to the students. But what I come back to is looking at family resemblances. What do all various things that get put in the bucket of religion share with each other? And I think what Mark said is absolutely right. When we look around the world and put things into the religion bucket, that's what we look for: transcendentals, master narratives. One thing that I like to put back on the table and remind students about is that it's about community. It's about identifying an us. Sometimes, often, that us involves creating a them or a he, or she that is like distant to us as well. But it doesn't always. But I do think that religion involves building a group of people that recognize an us as an us.
And so these questions, Mark, that you talk about, Alex, you say, the kinds of questions that religion answers. I'm wondering, as you heard me talk about stories and narratives, do you see those constructs, those ideas of story and narrative, how those fit, or how would you place those in terms of your description of religion?
Go ahead, Alex, you go first this time.
Okay. Well, I was thinking about a piece that one of my colleagues, one of my teachers at the University of Chicago Divinity School, wrote about the Capitol assault. And he analyzed how various evangelicals told themselves a story from the book of Joshua in the Hebrew Bible and in Christians' Old Testament, in labeling their protest or their assault, which they thought of as peaceful, as a Jericho march, right? So they came in with shofars, they invoked the justice of a just God, that he would look over them. And according to my colleague, if you know how the story of Joshua ends, the smiting of the citizens of Jericho, so that the Israelites could exercise dominion. The Israelites could exercise dominion over Jericho. Right. But what my colleague recognized as well is that the assaulters, conveniently, if you ask them, they'll sometimes forget the end of the narrative and say, "Well, no, we want the beginning of it, where there's the wrath and the fury that we're expressing, but it's peaceful still. We're still doing something that's absolutely peaceful." So for me, I think they are telling the story of Jericho again, maybe with a different ending in mind. I don't know if they necessarily expected bloodshed. Some of them might have. Some of them might have gone because they thought they were telling a new story in the same master narrative, where God would do something righteous and vindicate them somehow.
Great.
Just one story.
Yeah. Mark, religion, is it story, narrative, both, neither? How do the concepts of narrative and religion in your mind show up, particularly in your work? Yeah.
Well, you could say, religion is a search for truth, is what all religions will say, but it's also a story to bind people together. From an anthropological standpoint, we can use race or tribe or nationality or ethnicity or religion to tell a common story that sets a set of shared values that helps us feel a sense of belonging, feel a sense of protection, especially if there's warlike areas going on. So religion and race are both stories. I would say as an anthropologist, race is a social construct. But I like your word much better, story. It's a story we tell to put ourselves in boxes that give us connectedness with whoever's in our box.
Right. And I think that the way that I was constructing it, I need everybody to hear me when I say this. What I'm saying right now isn't the truth. I'm not saying it like this is the only way to think about it. I'm saying it like this is how I think about it. And to the extent that you all want to think differently about it, I want to invite that. I really want to encourage that, because this is really how we play with these ideas. And so I may say something that for some of you, it kind of pushes against something that, the way that you relate to something. And I do want to encourage you to come in and, offer a counter thinking, or, point out where I may be mistaken. So, Mark, this idea of a story. So this is why I think of religion very much in the narrative frame, where narratives connect multiple stories. Because if you take any of these individual stories, they all are connected inside of a particular narrative frame, right? And so there's a way in which they're supposed to relate. And certain stories, we tell like Alex was saying, you tell part of the Jericho story and you don't get all the way to the end of it, because if you follow that all the way to the end, it's not a pretty picture, right? Every living thing, people who don't know the Jericho story, the children of Israel were on their march. They're supposed to go into the promised land. They encounter this town of Ai, and they're the Jericho wall, and they march around the wall like 7 times. And then at the end of the time, they were at the end of the time, the 7th time, they blow the horn, the walls fall, they rush in, and they say God told them to kill everything. So they kill everything that's breathing, the animals, the women, the children. It's not pretty. But somehow the narrative is constructed in a way that gives permission for genocide, right? So this narrative is there, and it's part of it, connects multiple other stories. Before I leave this, I want to, there is a question in the box about folks in the Jericho March that were wearing, were wearing things like Auschwitz T-shirts and 6NME T-shirts, and carrying Nazi flags and those kinds of things. And so it's hard to put, I don't know how to put all of that into the same. Sometimes you get this mashup of ideologies and narratives. And it may well be, this is what we want to talk about later, not even today, but it may well be that a narrative form, a discursive form that connects a particular form of Christianity with Nazism and Confederacism is white supremacy. That may be a narrative framing that allows those to all connect and make some sense. Let's put that off for another conversation, because it's possible that white supremacy is a religion. So let's do this. So now, Alex, I know you teach religion, but what is a race?
I just read a brilliant book that I'm still trying to get my head around by Barbara and Karen Fields.
Oh
called
yeah.
Racecraft.
Racecraft. Brilliant. Yeah.
And one of them is an anthropologist and studies traditional African religious traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And so they came up with this idea based on their study of witchcraft.
Mm-hmm.
And they saw that racecraft and witchcraft have things in common. And they argue that race isn't a thing, right? Biologists have discovered, looking at our DNA, it's not something that we're actually exists.
Mm-hmm.
It's a story. It's a
Right.
grand narrative that we keep telling ourselves over and over.
Mm-hmm.
And they say that race is the after effect, the magical after effect that's conjured from racism,
Mm-hmm.
right? This idea that some people should dominate and do dominate other people, and that people belong in these boxes. And race is just sort of, if embraced positively, it's trying to wrestle with racism in a
Mm-hmm.
positive way, changing that concept, saying, "Oh yes, we are all Chinese people, and we all." It's not that we all are building the railroad together. It's that we speak the same language and enjoy the same foods, and that is heritable in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I'm thinking about in terms of race as a narrative recently. But I
Yeah.
know there are so many different visions of how that story gets told, or
Mm-hmm.
even whether to think of it as witchcraft or not.
Yeah. Yeah. And Mark, you were saying before, from an anthropological perspective, you think about race as
Story. It's a social construct will be the term, but it's a story. Professor Augustine Fuentes, who's the chairman of the anthropology department, gives a great lecture on what is race. If anybody ever gets a chance to see him, he does it beautifully. But race is a story. Like you were saying, some stories have happy endings, some stories don't have happy endings. I like movies with happy endings. I look at the story of race in America with, and I see progress. I see from slavery to Reconstruction to Jim Crow to the civil rights and to what we're doing now. We're getting past that. And you talk about this narrative, you talk about this master narrative, and the master narrative now is the 1619 Project. And in that story, I, as a white 57-year-old, am the villain of that story. I don't want to play that character in that story. Give me a story where I can be the hero, because all of our problems will be solved. They have to be biracial and they have to be bipartisan. If we want to solve our problems, we have to stop calling each other irredeemable, this is and that's, if we want to solve the problems. And we don't do that by making people villains. Let's appeal to your heroic qualities. You want to see that story, and at the end, I'm the hero, not the villain. And I think we need to create a story to solve the problems too, a narrative. I don't think the 1619 Project is it, because I don't want to be the villain in your story. I want to be the hero. And we've got a lot of heroism in America we can appeal to if we choose to make that our narrative, to say, great, let's appeal to that and say, what's the next 3 things we got to solve? And let's work on them together instead of half of each other calling each other irredeemable. That's not a good story. That's not going to solve our problems with race.
Yeah. So the thing is, though, that white guys always are the hero in all of history, right? Like, so history is written so that white guys get to be the hero in all of the stories, right? I love the movie Avatar. You know that movie, Avatar? It's one of my favorite movies because in Avatar, the white guy gets to go destroy the culture. And when it's about to be destroyed and people are about to set upon it, then he gets to turn around, he gets a new mindset, and then he gets to be the savior in the same set of stories. It is a brilliant thing. Avatar turns my stomach so deeply because it is entertaining, and it's no problem. It's no problem with the contradiction that the same one who destroyed it is the same one who gets to fix it. So I don't know that the 1619 Project constructs white people as villains. I think it constructs whiteness as villainry, as a context in which villainry happens, in which all of these things happen, and there are multiple things that actually get that happen inside of that framing of whiteness. A lot of people got swept up in it. People got to become white. White was a thing you wanted to be. So when Poles got to the United States, they weren't white yet. They had to work and take on certain kinds of responsibilities and attitudes to invite them into whiteness. When Italians came, they weren't white. When Irish came, they weren't white. They had to work and do certain things and demonstrate their willingness to adopt certain things in order to operate within whiteness. And this is the thing that's really important about that. which goes back to our notion about religion, is the narratives are maintained over time by practice. Most religions have both a way of thinking, but also a symbolism and ways of being. There are practices, right, that are part of the way that the ideas, that the system of beliefs gets transmitted from generation to generation, from people to people. You pick up certain practices: prayer practice, meditative practice, dieting. All of those are parts of those are narrative practices. And so religions are really narrative practices, in the same way that Fields and Fields describe the relationship to racism as practices, right? And so you act in certain ways and you explain it. The explanatory value is race, right? So it could be that both religion and race are a system of narrative practices. Thoughts about that?
Well, I guess I'm saying we write the story. I don't know what the story is, but let's write a story where white and black people are walking across the line together as heroes. We're both heroes. We're all got to be heroes to solve the problem. Find that narrative. That's the narrative we need to tell each other as Americans, to really be together and to cross that finish line to get to where we want to be. And not just in race, but too often we demonize each other nowadays in America. We need to build each other up. So let's figure out what that narrative is, where we're both heroes. We're all heroes.
That's what I'm looking for. That's what I'm looking forward to doing. That is the work that we're doing in this over these next 8 weeks, is how do we construct new narratives, because the ones that we have don't necessarily serve that purpose. Alex, there's a question that's in the chat. In addition to what you were about to say, I'm going to invite you to answer another question, because you're a professor of religion and you have a sense of this. You probably can answer it even better than I can. Someone said, can you discuss the way the doctrine of teleology might contribute to stories of race and religion in America? Do you know this construct of teleology?
Teleology, from the Greek, putting telos and logos together.
Yeah.
I don't do Greek. I just sometimes know the etymologies of things. A teleological story is a story that we already know the ending to. Telos means end. Yeah, and I think what Mark is asking for is, or what I hear you asking for, Mark, is a story, where we're all happy and hugging at the end and we've crossed it together. And I'm interested in that story too, actually. When I hear about the Capitol rioters or the people who supported Trump, or family members of mine who supported Trump, I want to know, how can I redeem these people, right? How do I get them to have that, if you're familiar with the Christian story, that Saul to Paul moment, right? That moment where the scales fall from their eyes and they say, oh, I was so wrong. And I see now that, supporting this was racist and I want to be with you. And I want to cross the finish line together. I want to be redeemed. I want to know how to tell that story too. And it's hard for me to know how to take the next narrative step when some people aren't willing to play the villain for once, right? And say, oh, actually I was Saul. Or, I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, so this idea, the teleology, the idea that there is an end, is actually, it's interesting in narrative framing, because narrative is kind of a durable thing. It creates trajectory, but not necessarily an end point. So one of the things that I guess the religions of the people of the book, so Judaism, Christianity, Islam, there is a teleology. There is a arrived at endpoint, although it's in different framings. It's told in very different ways, and the trajectory for how we get there is different. I wonder how, because I wonder whether I guess this would be the question, whether there is a redemptive collective kind of a teleology and endpoint where there is a shared future of flourishing. How, if at all, do the divisions that have been crafted by or constructed in the practices of race and religion, do they even lend themselves to that? Like, do they, like the current construction of most religious practice systems end up creating, there are some that don't do this, but many of them create cultural distinctions, the us and them, Alex, that you were talking about. And so there are ways in which people grab onto the belief systems, the practices, but then they still have kind of culturally segregated experiences or expressions of them. Like they're making different meaning from the same set of, out of the same wellspring of stories. They're making different meanings. They end up separating themselves out. I wonder if that's always the case. I don't know, Mark, in South Africa, if you were seeing places where religion wasn't dividing people, or Alex, in your expression, beyond Christianity, but in some of the other Eastern traditions, are there ways in which religion doesn't create kind of the other identity, us and them? Like it transcends those identities.
I mean, in South Africa, religion is probably the only one thing that really brought black and white people together, because most black South Africans are Christians, very few Muslims there. I think that was one of the only unifying things. It's very, very segregated. And it's not, there's 3 black tribes where they all don't like each other and have histories of war. There's 2 white tribes with the English and Dutch. Religion was probably the only thing that unified people in South Africa, not even close to where it needs to be, but I didn't see religion as a problem in South Africa.
Mark, can I ask as well? I know that it's a common saying that we have here in the States that Sunday morning is the most racially segregated hour in or time in the States, because blacks go to their church and whites go to their church, and they're not often the same church. Do people go to church together, worship together, take communion together?
In South Africa, every hour is the most segregated hour in South Africa, unfortunately. There were a couple, there's one church we went to, it was a very small church. We would rotate churches every week with the kids. There was one church that had maybe 20 people. That was the only place we went to that had a mixed race congregation. And that was very unusual. It's just very segregated. And part of it is by design to keep the peace. I mean, if people stay on their side of the street, so to speak, you have predictability and stability, and that's valuable in South Africa. But religion wasn't a thing that was the driving force, like Professor was talking about in some other societies. Religion wasn't it. It was purely the race and the apartheid history that was the divisive forces there, not religion.
You asked about the potentiality of various Eastern traditions, and a huge stereotype that we have of Buddhism here in the West is that it's always naturally peaceful, it's always friendly, it's always nonviolent. And we've been seeing more and more racial or exclusion on the basis of ethnicity in Southeast Asia and Burma, for instance, recently. I don't know how many of you are paying attention to the news, or Sri Lanka, which has a Buddhist majority that is often involved in civil war with Hindus, and sometimes Christians get caught and Muslims get caught up too in various public terrorist attacks. Mm-hmm. I think as well about this vision, right, from Christian New Testament, where all these various tribes, Jew and Gentile, are invited to form a common church, overcome their differences, come together as one. It's a beautiful vision. But then I wonder, what about those that don't want to be Christian, don't want to give away their Jewishness? They seem to be outside of the table by creating a new us that takes apart all the former divisions. You're creating new divisions.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a problem that, you know, is really exercises me sometimes.
Right.
That there are these potentials in religion, but they create new problems.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is where the idea of hegemony, why I wanted to make sure that that was part of our conversation, the notions of hegemony, because in some ways, the promotion of a unifying religious force seems to have um, a telos that is, in fact, you know, grand and peaceful and engaging, and yet, in many instances, imposing a worldview, a particular worldview, insisting on a particular worldview for others is one of the most uh, impactful forms of violence that there is. Like insisting on a worldview, we've seen that in the name of religion. We've seen it in the name of race. We've seen it in any number of other names. But you're right, that telos, where everybody comes together and they all believe in the same thing, it has at least a thread of the possibility of creating kind of a domination order, a hegemonic narrative that seeks to impose its will on others in ways that doesn't support full flourishing, right? So part of what we want to be able to investigate together are whether there are ways of thinking and imagining narratives, the framing that is religion, the framing that is race, and this isn't any specific religion, but the notion of religion which has a certain amount of legitimacy and rigidity associated with kind of its origin. It has a kind of a divine, a supernatural, a not necessarily human constructed origin, which then makes it sometimes more difficult to maneuver, to change, to broaden in ways that allow for kind of a more expansive, full flourishing for those who are inside and those who are outside who encounter it. This is the thing that we're trying to figure out. And we're also trying to figure out what value is there for race, the narratives of race, and then how, if at all, do we shift those? How do we construct counter narratives that allow for more full flourishing, to create the greater likelihood of full flourishing for everybody, regardless of the socially constructed group in which they have been assigned. One of the points in the chat that I do want to talk about before we get out, someone says that they think that narrative is about what has happened and not what will happen. It's a description of the past, and narratives characterize and explain and make sense of the past, but they also do it in a way that projects a future. They're durable in the way that they project a future. So your first thoughts, as we imagine trying to craft, Mark, you're calling for this early on. You're saying we need a new set of narratives. For Mark, for Alex, as you're beginning to imagine like a narrative that allows for full flourishing, that allows for peaceful interaction, where there isn't your side of the street and my side of the street, where there isn't like those necessary divisions, what are the first thoughts that you're beginning to have about what might be components or aspects or qualities of such a narrative?
Well, I think we live in a country that has many races, many nationalities, many religions, and that's great. We don't want to change that. So I think we need to come up, though, and we've done this with varying success in our history, but we need to come up with an American narrative that says something that all of us can be proud of as Americans, whatever that narrative is. We we need something that binds us together while we keep our different races, religions, and everything. We need to find some American narrative we can all be proud of, I think, and that would bind us together as Americans, and hopefully that would lead to easing the tensions and making us all live together more harmoniously.
So when we do the American narrative and we draw the circle around either the geography or the citizenship of America, of the United States, I imagine, when you say an American narrative, you're saying the United States and not like all of America, right? So if we're drawing that, when we draw that line, and it's something that we're all proud of, what I always worry about as a person who practices in the realm of peace, because there's another construct that also trips us up all the time, which is this fiction about borders, right? Fiction about borders and nations. And so every time we have a hard and fast thing, race, religion, nation, that we treat as a reality as opposed to as a fiction, as a heuristic for understanding and explaining the ways that people relate, it always creates the possibility for the next wave of exclusion. So I worry about that. It may well be that what we need is an American narrative of some sort, but I worry about how to construct that and not create that external nationalist thing.
That's why we need to find a really good author to write that great narrative that can balance all those things together. And whatever it is, that's what we need, though. Part of us needs to all be American to say something binds us all together, as opposed to we're all in our own little islands and my side of the street, like you were saying. I don't have the answer what it is, but that's what we need.
All right, but Alex has an answer. Alex has a thought about what it's going to be or what the quality of it is. And so, Alex, take it away.
Oh yeah, I do. I was thinking a lot as you were speaking, Mark, of Joe Biden's inauguration speech. Actually, various lines from it, we will never, ever, ever, ever fail if we work together, if we stand together, right? He is projecting a sort of practice where by reconciling, we as Americans will be excellent, right? And we will make America great again, actually, to borrow his predecessor's language. And David, when you were speaking, I was thinking about another line where he used this chiasmatic structure, rhetorical structure. He said, other nations will, instead of following the example of our power, they'll follow the power of our example, right? So I think one story we could tell, or one solution I propose, is that we just make everybody American. Everybody in the world, you can come here. You can be American. I don't know if the citizens of Turtle Island, who were originally here first, would be happy with that. But I mean, that's one way to cut across that division, is to say, we're everywhere now, and you are all us.
Yeah.
And you can govern this place with us.
Okay. Well, thank you both. We're going to keep playing with this idea of narratives. And particularly that narratives and the way that religion and race get shaped in narrative form, and then investigate how, if at all, what would be methodologies or possibilities for reconstructing or for reforming particular narratives so that things like race and religion don't occur as divisional markers in the ways that people exist in the world, what their possibilities are, their opportunities for flourishing, their place in a hierarchy, to the extent that hierarchies exist. Is there a necessary place in hierarchy, or is there a narrative that says that things like race and religion and gender don't necessarily predict or determine social power? So we're going to keep playing with that. So Alex, thank you. Mark, thank you very much for being conversation partners. I am looking forward to continuing the conversation next week. Let me make sure Was I planning to address the question of cult this evening? No. So now that we have this language about narrative, meta-narrative, hegemony, and we've seen how it defines or how it can be used to characterize race practices, narrative practices that sustain the idea of race, narrative practices that perpetuate and sustain religion over time. We do want to make some distinction between what's a religion and what's a cult. And I want to do that. I'm going to send out, I'll get the program administrators to send out, I've got to find the right article, but to talk about why the Southern Baptist Convention rejects the notion of critical race theory. This is a very specific instance, but what it does is it starts to point to an intersection that may also help us to elucidate the distinction between religion and cult, if there is such a thing as a distinction between religion and cult, right? And so that's going to be our work for next week. I'm going to send out, I'll work with Josh and Sheila, Mahan and Tim to send out something for us to chew on before next week. So thank you all very, very much. I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate both of you as conversation partners, and I look forward to the next week.